It's season 3, episode 1. As you read by the title, that's correct. 90s horror films. Quick recap. Also, 90s kids movies. Quick recap also as well. Anyway. So, I'm actually going to discuss those. We'll start the episode now. Also, welcome back. If you're new to the podcast, to season 3, episode 1 starts now. This podcast is also being recorded in real time. Anyway, so since this is being recorded in real time, as you may notice, things look a little different. That's fine. So the horror film for today is going to be that I have selected. What the show is about tonight is about the 1994 classic Wes Craven's New Nightmare from 1994. So, majority of you may or may not remember that movie, which is fine. If you do, you do. If you don't, you don't. Either way. So, now, this is a very strange film, the way it starts out. I mean, it was cool, but so what had started out was so it's about 10 years later in the main star's life after defeating Freddy Krueger in 1984 in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Then, about 10 years later, cast and crew for this film in particular, in New Nightmare, for some reason. So it's 10 years later, Freddy's back, where he does make a surprise comeback, by the way. And then, so it starts out where Heather Langenkamp is playing herself in this movie, instead of playing her character Nancy this time. So then, all of a sudden, things are okay. So she's having this dream that she's on the movie set, and all of a sudden, things are going great. And then all of a sudden, things start to go horribly wrong. And then, also, a lot of the other people in this movie also were playing themselves. And there were also some real life coincidence of things that were also actually happening to the cast and crew in real life that made it into the movie, by the way. I just wasn't sure if a lot of people knew that or not. Anyway, so then things start to go horribly wrong. She literally sees the special effects technicians actually get hurt really bad and then died. Then, next thing you know, she literally hears the director actually yell cut. So then, all of a sudden, next thing you know, from all the chaos, next thing you know, all of a sudden, you see this big, huge black thing go across the screen being pushed by two people while her child is sitting on his bed. And then, all of a sudden, there's that she wakes up for real, almost falls during a real actual earthquake that also took place around the same time. And, so she wakes up in reality, almost falls. Then, all of a sudden, bolts down to the kid's bedroom, her and her husband. And then all of a sudden, the earthquake goes on and then just suddenly stops, I'm like, whoa, okay. So then, they proceed with their day. And, so everything's fine, things are going great. So they proceed with their day. Then it cuts to breakfast time. So they're still proceeding with their day. All of a sudden, her husband leaves for work. And then, all of a sudden, the earthquake suddenly starts again. The walls start shaking and everything. So then, all of a sudden, Sudden, her phone rings. Obviously, we know who it was. So then, she goes to run after her husband and be like, hey, yo, wait a minute. He's already gone. He literally had just left for work. And also, next thing you know, for some reason, all of a sudden, here comes the babysitter. And then the phone rings slightly after that. Except this time, it's not Freddy Krueger. It's actually the limo driver telling her she's going to be late for work. And something she said. And that's kind of how I started liking the movie, actually, to be honest with you. And also, next thing you know, so she hops in the limo, and then all of a sudden, she's sitting there on this talk show, and then they have a surprise for her. Now, this is where you see, a.k.a. Robert Englund, who actually plays Freddy Krueger in the movie, surprise her on national television, Then, all of a sudden, while that's all going on, there was the Demon Freddy, which was another thing. So then, that's who's been stalking her and calling her, And so, she gets home, her kid's like freaking out, real bad, having some type of nightmare, obviously. And then, but before that is shown, all of a sudden, she gets a call, runs over to New Line Cinema really quick. And then, all of a sudden, next thing you know, after that, she's over at Wes Craven's house talking to him about the movie where she's playing herself, because she was actually asked to join them in the definitive nightmare. By the way, also, speaking of that, not to interrupt, but I also have a short YouTube clip also on my YouTube channel, actually called The Definitive Nightmare. It's just a short clip that I have over my YouTube channel. I highly suggest you check that out. It's probably Blast of Strangeness or Blast and Work, something like that. Anyway, back to what I was saying. So, next thing you know, then it shows her going home after being over at Wes Craven's house, because her kid's literally flipping out. And then, she discovers that this ancient demon Freddy is actually real. She starts to see things falling apart right in front of her. So then about later that night, things are going strangely chaotic. Kinda. They seemed normal at first, Then about, at one point while she's asleep, she has this dream that her husband in the movie is actually going to be killed by Freddy, which does actually end up happening. But I also want to point out that something similar happened like that in, I want to say, Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4. The Dream Child or the Dream Master, some shit like that. Anyway, so then, or it might have also even been Freddy's Dead, the Final Nightmare. I don't know, but anyway, that also happened in one of the other movies too. Of course, I can't remember which one. So then, you also see at one point in this movie a few references to the original A Nightmare on Elm Street in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, by the way. I mean, at first you're probably thinking, no, you don't. Actually, yes, you do. So anyway, all of a sudden, it cuts to this really weird scene where, she has that dream and it turns out to actually be real. Then, all of a sudden, she literally almost pukes her guts out in the morgue scene that was shown in the movie. Then it cuts to the scene where she takes her kid to the park, So all of a sudden, he's like climbing up on this thing and literally starts to fall. From what I understand, from my understanding, I guess that child actor at the time, who is an adult nowadays, actually still has that thing from that movie in his backyard, from what I understand. So then after that scene, it just cuts to everything's normal. And then, all of a sudden, things go wrong again, to where all of a sudden, she keeps getting all this weird mail that actually spells out, that the kid takes them all out of the drawer, spells it all out. It actually spells out, answer the phone. A lot of people would say that's not what it spells out. Actually, yes, it does. And then all of a sudden the phone rings and we know who it is, obviously. Yeah. I know. That's what I thought. I was like, okay, interesting. So then, all of a sudden, it cuts to this next weird scene to where, something happens, or kid starts foaming at the mouth or something, and, starts having going through some weird things. And, so she brings him to the hospital, like any other parent would, obviously. If you would, obviously, if you had kids or whatever. So then, next thing you know. So then you don't actually see Freddy Krueger in this movie after the talk show scene in New Nightmare. You literally don't see him again until that's the part we're getting to next. But the Freddy that you do end up seeing is not, well, it's not the regular Freddy. It's actually more the demon Freddy, who actually takes the demon form of Freddy Krueger in the first place. So, anyway, so then it cuts to the hospital scene, where you see the English teacher from the original Nightmare on Elm Street in the hospital playing one of the nurses this time. I was like, hey, that's a cool reference right there. That is amazing. That it had Nightmare on Elm Street references within it. Anyway, next thing you know. So, the mother's at the hospital with her kid. Then she's got to leave for a while, And, she does go back. So, in the meantime, I think she was either at Wes Craven's house again or something. Or someone's house. I think it was Wes, pretty sure. So then, she tries to call Robert Englund, and she does talk to him at one point prior to that. And, he suddenly starts understanding, like, whoa, my character who I play, what do you mean? It's like, It's more of, he understood, like, it was getting more darker, more evil, more real, more demon-like, and he understood that. As Heather was like, whoa, wait, that's actually really going on. Okay. So, she tries to get hold of him. She can't, because just couldn't get hold of him. So then, all of a sudden, so then it cuts to the scene, to where she's sitting home, and all of a sudden, everything's going great. She's home watching TV, doing her thing, whatever. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, she's reading some book, about her kid's condition or whatever that he's going through. So she's reading that. All of a sudden, next thing you know, the earthquake sort of kind of starts a little bit. And, she hears this really weird sound. Her TV comes on, and it's some news clip about the earthquakes that were really going on in that area at the time. And it was also going on about Freddy Krueger, actually, about the series and how the actual real glove went missing. So it comes on some random news station that she's watching. And the funny thing is, in real life, the glove actually really did go missing for real, which a lot of you do not know about that. But that's besides the point. Also, by the way, welcome back. And also, if you're new, it's a blessing to have you on the channel. And I knew that was going to happen. Okay. That thing decided to go out. Of course it did. So anyway, back to what I was saying. So, Heather hears this really weird noise, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, literally out of nowhere, she hears that noise coming from her closet, so she goes to look. All of a sudden, power goes out. Next thing you know, there he literally lunges at her and sees Freddy Krueger. But she didn't see her regular Freddy Krueger. She saw the demon Freddy Krueger, who looks right at her and says, "Miss me?" It's like, "What? Miss me? No, not really." And then as she's running away from him, she literally almost falls. So does he, because all of a sudden a real earthquake actually starts. Then he's just looking at her like, "Nancy." I'm like, huh? Okay, next. And then all of a sudden, earthquake happens, Freddy gets her, cuts her arm and shit. And then all of a sudden, he's gone, just disappears, So next thing you know, all of a sudden she was like, "Uh-oh, my child, oopsies." So then all of a sudden, it cuts to the scene to where, she is literally at the hospital, trying to see her kid, and come to find out the babysitter Julie in that movie had this really horrible dream. So she decided to go see the kid too at the hospital. And Heather and Julie are having the same problem, The problem is they can't see Dylan because the hospital was like, "Yeah, no. Because apparently, I guess the way that it works, the pediatrics, I guess apparently there's, I guess after a certain time in the evening, there are no evening visiting hours, or that's strictly how it was back then. I don't know if it's changed since then or not. Well, I guess you could up to a certain time do visiting, and then you had to leave, because that's just how it works, So now, before we get any further into that, so also I forgot to mention that John Saxon was also in this movie. He was also in A Nightmare on Elm Street and A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3, The Dream Warriors. And he was also in Wes Craven's New Nightmare as well. But anyway, we'll get back to that in a minute about John Saxon. So, now, anyway, so Heather and Julie are at the hospital trying to see Dylan. And, so they are not too happy that Julie and Heather are there, but they kind of let him see him. So, at one point, Heather has this dream to where, she falls asleep, because she's really tired. And, so the nurse, so all the nurses and the head nurse, they're letting her sleep. So one point while she falls asleep, they moved Dylan to the intensive care unit in the hospital for further testing, Then, all of a sudden, that's kind of where Heather's like, that's kind of where Julie's like, "Hey, Heather, I've got Dylan here, they're kind of don't want me here, give or take." So then, So Heather has this really weird dream, where she sees the head nurse turn into Freddy Krueger, and she sees her son Dylan talking like Freddy Krueger, and all of a sudden, she wakes up, she literally freaks out, all the nurses and the head nurse or doctor or whatever, they all come running in, like, what the hell's going on, So, that happens. And then next thing, so when she's asking, like, where's her kid, so they tell her. And then this is where you see one of the best cameos in the 1990s that I have ever seen in a horror film other than the 1990s. All of a sudden, that's when you see Jessica Craven make her appearance as one of the hospital nurses, which is a really cool scene, by the way. So, so she tells the main lady, the doctor / nurse lady, or what the hell ever she is, so she tells her, with the kid's condition, something with lack of sleep or something, and, the symptoms of, what's going on and everything. And, and so she's like, well, he's fine, actually. He just came around a few minutes ago, and, yeah. So, all of a sudden, next thing you know, this is where it gets interesting, because when they move Dylan to the intensive care unit in the hospital, where Julie is with him, his babysitter, so Heather goes to that part of the hospital, and Jessica Craven, she's standing there as one of the nurses, and, that part of the hospital, apparently, at the time, I don't know if it's still like this, so it's a restricted area. So, Heather, she goes running into the restricted area, and then all of a sudden, she sees Jessica Craven there, and she's like, hey, this is a restricted area. Do you have a pass? All of a sudden, here's another A Nightmare on Elm Street reference. Nancy, a.k.a. Heather's famous line of screw your pass was also referenced in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, and was also said in A Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984. Heather said that line then, and then she said it again. Then, all of a sudden, so the nurse is like, it's all right, it's fine, just go in. So then, all of a sudden, so she's pulled in, so she's in there, and then all of a sudden, her son Dylan says something to her about some dinosaur Rex or some shit, who's like the guard or something, or the protector. So, so he's talking to him, or, so he says to her something about him, to keep Freddy away. So all of a sudden, the main nurse / doctor lady person, a security guard and a cop or whatever, pull Heather, into another room to talk. So she sees the cot on her arms, and she's like, whoa, holy shit. Literally, like, stunned. So she starts talking to her, asking her a couple of questions, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, so they're talking, and then all of a sudden she asks her a couple of questions about her life and her career, but then again, being a celebrity, being well recognized like that, why would someone in the medical field suddenly not ask you that? I don't know. That's what I'd like to know. So they ask her that, all of a sudden, next thing you know, she has asked that a couple of questions, then one of the questions that she's asked, this is where I noticed she literally tries to leave at one point, and they're like, nope, not going to happen. Sit down. So then, all of a sudden, one of the nurses comes in. Or no, two nurses. Two nurses come in. One was Jessica Craven, and then some other lady. So Julie's in there, but Heather had left very very specific instructions to Julie. Do not, whatever you do, don't let Dylan fall asleep. Do not let Dylan fall asleep. Shit, okay. So what do these two lovely nurses do? Well, I'll tell you what they do, actually. This is where it gets good. Hold on one second. Son of a bitch. Oh, so what do the nurses do? They come in, bring a couple shots of rounds of sedation to sedate Dylan so he falls asleep so Freddy can kill him. Literally. And that was not the plan. That was not Heather and Julie's plan. Heather and Julie's plan was to keep Dylan awake so that don't happen. Next thing you know, what happens? What happens? I'll tell you. So the two nurses come in and they're like, yeah, you miss, would you mind stepping out for a minute? Just a little shot. Just see if we get some sleep. That's all. Not going to hurt him. Oh, it'll be okay. Yeah, right. So she says no to the one lady, the other nurse, the older looking woman. And then the older woman is just like, do it to the younger girl. So she does. Oh, hold on. See, it's not going to hurt. All of a sudden, it hurts. But your kid go, ow! And I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? Really? Okay. Next. So, in the meantime, Julie's trying to stop the whole thing. So, she grabs the nurse's arm. Still has the nurse's arm. She's still grabbing it. Literally locked onto it like a fucking pit bull at this point. And so, the nurse is like, would you mind letting go of my arm? Or no. She says it more like this. Miss, would you mind letting go of my arm? Julie just looks at her. You bitch. Turn around, punches her in the face. I literally just start dying laughing, like seeing the whole thing unfold in this movie. So then she grabs that big round of sedation from the nurse, scares the other nurse, Jessica Craven, literally, and she's like, you know what? Oh, I know it's in that one. Do you have any idea what's in this one? Or what's going to happen when I stick you with it? Next thing you know, she's literally scares the shit out of her. She runs out of the room, both ladies, at that point. Julie locks the room, the door of that room, so they can't come in again. By that point, Dylan's having a hell of a hard time trying to stay awake. Next thing you know, all of a sudden, behind Julie, there's Freddy Krueger. So he's warning Julie, so she don't see anything. Next thing you know, all of a sudden, here's another Nightmare on Elm Street reference. The same thing that happened to Tina in A Nightmare on Elm Street ends up happening to Julie. Literally. And then, so Freddy's kind of just like staring at Dylan and just looking at him like, mm-hmm. And then next, Dylan literally must have unlocked the door. Somehow Dylan literally, Okay, so then that happens. The nurses come in, they see it because apparently, they're trying to unlock the door to get in the room. They can't. So, they call security. Meanwhile, they hear Julie screaming before she dies. Literally. So, security finally comes. They're on their way, and you hear the nurse say, can you hurry up and get down here with those keys? So, so they finally go in the room, unlock the door, see the chaos unfold, and just literally scream and run again. And then, all of a sudden, next thing you know, Dylan just runs out of there without even being seen at that point. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know. So, so Heather's like, I want my son out of here right now. Like, all right. She's like, no, you don't understand. This is how it's going to go down. So, so at one point, the nurse from earlier that got punched in the face tells Heather, that she can't go in there, cannot go in that room because of what just happened. Meanwhile, all of a sudden, while this is all taking place, you suddenly hear the alarm go off about a code yellow in pediatrics. And then so while the nurse says to Heather, you can't go in there, Heather literally just slams her elbow into her so hard to where she falls again. I'm just like, damn. Did this nurse already suffer enough abuse? Apparently not. Then all of a sudden, and next thing you know, so Heather just leaves the hospital frantically. Who wouldn't in their right mind? The nurse is like, uh-oh, the child's gone. Okay. Or main doctor / nurse or however. So then, Heather's trying to look for him. She sees him, and all of a sudden, she calls John Saxon in the meantime. And, he's just like, whoa, wait, what? Huh? Okay, all right. I'm on my way out of your house. Meanwhile, he's at her house, All of a sudden, next thing you know, she literally just sees Dylan walking across the freeway, literally, trying to get home to the house to grab the dinosaur. And, so he does encounter Freddy in the meantime. Like a bunch of Freddys he sees, And then, all of a sudden, Freddy is literally lifting him up over the traffic, drops him. Kid literally almost dies from that, the impact. So then, all of a sudden, so in the meantime, Dylan, runs to the house, grabs the dinosaur. Everything's great for now, So all of a sudden, Nancy, Heather, she sees the whole thing, and all of a sudden, all the chaos, with everything, so she sees John at her house because she finally gets home, and she's asking him, hey, he's like, Dylan, hey, he's right there. He's fine. Oh, and she's like, okay. So for some reason, while Heather was talking to John, at one point, Dylan goes back into the house, which I don't know why. That scene did not make sense to me whatsoever. But whatever. So he goes into the house. Freddy must have got him somehow. And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, so Heather's, she's talking to John, and another Nightmare on Elm Street reference. He starts calling her Nancy. Like in A Nightmare on Elm Street. And then all of a sudden she's like, why are you calling me Nancy, John? He's like, why you call me John, Nancy? Hello? Anyway. So, so he tells her, he's like, Nancy, Freddy's dead. Pull yourself together. Get some sleep. Don't start to lose it like your mother did. So, next thing you know, the house in Wes Craven's New Nightmare is not the same house from A Nightmare on Elm Street, although not throughout the whole movie it wasn't. It's not at first for quite a ways into the movie, but so after, John Saxon leaves, pulls away in his police cruiser, all of a sudden, Nancy's house turns into the Nightmare on Elm Street house. Reference to 1984's Nightmare on Elm Street, right there. So she goes running in, and it's all the setup of her house from 1994 instead of 1984. So she goes running in, she's running in, looking around. All of a sudden, suddenly she finds all the sleeping pills that the hospital gave to her kid. So she takes them, next thing you know, somehow, she winds up going through Dylan's bed, and next thing you know, she's literally goes flying through this weird looking thing and then falls into the fire chambers of hell, literally. So all of a sudden, she's looking for a kid, she don't see him at first, then all of a sudden they find each other, yada yada yada. So they, try to figure out, what to do about Freddy, in the meantime. So at this point, Freddy literally has Dylan almost completely. Heather, Heather, she comes along, saves the day, or tries to save the day at first. So then all of a sudden, Freddy just looks at her, looking at all the barrel of snakes, and just goes something about, I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was something, make a pet for the Rugrat bitch, or something like that. Or make a pet cat for the Rugrat bitch. I was like, wait, what? Okay. Then all of a sudden you hear Heather say her famous line, "Fuck you!" out of nowhere. Literally. So then all of a sudden, she shoves a snake into Freddy's eye. Freddy, eventually does pull it out. I'm like, ow, that had to hurt. Son of a bitch. So then all of a sudden, next thing you know, she tries to save the day again, at this point, so Nancy or what the hell's her name? Heather and Dylan, they push Freddy, into the fire chambers of hell, close the gate on it, all of a sudden, not many people recognize this or catch this, but the camera, actually, during filming, or while trying to film this scene in this movie, the camera's motor twice actually froze during that scene. And, so it was fixed and worked out. And then during that scene, part of the setup of the fireway, the way they had it for the movie, the monitor, while they were watching everything that was recording and capturing everything, the one piece of the set, how they had it all set up and rigged up, literally melts from it being so hot there with the fire, But apparently what it did was, when the flames got a little too high, it was actually that, for some reason, part of that scene was actually the camera and the monitor, while it was capturing everything, it actually recorded it backwards. So, instead of taking it out of the movie and reshooting it, they just said, just leave it in there and just keep it. We'll just roll with it. Keep it, just roll with it, All right, so finally, they push Freddy in there, he finally dies, So, as that's happening, Freddy's world starts to fall apart, So, all of a sudden, Heather looks at Dylan and screams, "Run!" So they both go running out of there, come back out of Dylan's bed, and it's morning time, sun's out, And then all of a sudden, she sees a script for the movie right there. There's a note in there from Wes Craven. And the note actually did say this, for real. "Heather, thank you for playing Nancy one last time. And Freddy's back where he belongs. And but best regards, Wes." Or something like that, it said. But funny thing is, though, the script for that movie, Heather's husband had a copy of that script. He actually got it from Wes Craven. He hid it in their son's bedroom for a while not to be noticed up until afterwards when she finds it. So then, she reads it to her son, and And then all of a sudden, movie's over with a happy ending. And that is literally, that's how it happened. That was the ending of the movie. And there will also be more about this next week. I will see you all in the next episode for next week. Bye.